Thank you so much. We're a bit behind the schedule, but we have time for a couple of questions. So please, Anis has a question. Maybe we take several questions. Leon, and then the lady behind. Unless I missed someone. Please, Anis, go ahead.
This is not a question, just an observation because with regard to inflation targeting, the countries, if you divide the countries without doing much econometrics, what I looked at in my paper, I reported that the non-inflation targeting countries and compare the inflation targeting countries, the growth rate did not much significantly different, the performance, unless the countries started from a very high inflation. Then reduce, as I say, we all say the very high inflation is bad for growth. So if it's the very high inflation, you bring it down, then you can see some positive impact. But other than a normal circumstance, if you divide two groups of countries, IT and non-IT, the difference is very marginal, almost no difference. And the second thing is the growth is not the only other thing. If you look at the poverty, because we are talking about southern countries, poverty, inequality, what impact it has. That is the thing. And then this Khan and the other paper, it's coming from IMF, which found 1% threshold for developed countries. And this is a classic example of how the complex econometrics and data can drive the results without any plausible story. 1% inflation target. I mean, okay, even in a developed country threshold, which is ridiculous. Frankly speaking, and it is published and things like that. On the 11th they say, they are for the developing countries. I read that paper many times to understand between the lines. No, they were trying to trick. It's completely full of tricks, and actually they find the maximum for the developing countries 18%. Then they force it to 11 to 13%. And in the conclusion there, they say it will be better for developing countries to keep inflation at a single-digit level. What is the basis? The result is 18%. Then they force some condition and come to 11 to 13%. In the conclusion, they say it will be better to keep it below single digit. I just want to finish reading a quotation from Dudley Sears, 1963. Dudley Sears is a famous development economist. One obstacle to the reconstruction of economics, that is for the developing country economics of the South, is that we have not really grasped, still less accepted, the point that the subject we have inherited was built in and for the countries with which the profession was familiar, namely developed industrial economies. Just because New Zealand accepted it. The whole business is made much more difficult by the widespread practice that authors and lecturers have of not merely concentrating on the economics of some developed industrial countries, but presenting it as universally valid. I stop here.
Thank you, Anis. I would still think that some calculations are better than no calculations at all, so wrong calculations can be beaten only with the right calculations. But Leon, please go ahead. Let's collect the questions, and then we'll give the floor to the presenters.
I'm just wondering, in the sense that this issue of central bank independence, it sort of holds for sort of normal sort of environment, when individual countries get into recessions and so on. I'm just wondering if you have a sense of a global financial crisis, the nature of central bank independence, because if you think of the US Congress and even Australia and so on, that it also depends on the regime types. You might have democracy, but who happens to empower at a certain point in time? So in the sense that if you have conservative governments in charge, they might force the central bank. So the central bank might like to have much greater stimulus, but they hit the lower bound of the interest rates. So the question really is that both fiscal policy and monetary policy should work in tandem to support, to lift the country out of recession. But you have a conservative governments in power, for example, maybe ideological driven, who actually refuse to stimulate, or they prematurely stop the stimulus and instead goes into austerity. And then central banks would like to go into low interest rate, force into the lower bound. I'm sure there are some countries that try negative interest rates, but I think there are sort of certain barriers that prevent from central banks from moving to direction. So I'm not sure whether it's a question or is it a comment, but I think it's something worth thinking about.
Thank you, thank you. And there is a lady behind, please. Yes.
Thank you for very interesting talks. I'm a PhD student. So while thinking about the independence of central bank, I was just reflecting again, and it's quite a tricky topic, especially seeing it from the point of southern countries and what I know best, the realities from Georgia. Because on the one hand, there is a lot of critique to this idea of independent central bank, and these critique points were also raised. And I personally share this critique and the whole idea of depoliticizing central banks. But on the other hand, if we look at countries like Georgia or other transition countries, there is a whole lot of mistrust generally to states or state institutions, and also there is a whole lot of negative experience as a hyperinflation, for example, with this too narrow relations with the government and the central bank. So to promote something which would go against the idea of independent central bank, it's very difficult also in the public discourse, because then all of this also very legitimate counterpoints arise that this is not effective. So I was wondering, and I'm curious to hear, maybe there is another third way, something in between to think of between independent or very dependent central banks, or maybe we could redefine this focus of this debate and remove it from this dependence-independence topic and shift it somewhere else and talk more about the functions and the main missions of the central bank. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. They say in many post-communist countries they're trying to be more Catholic than the Pope. This is a pretty new fashionable idea, independence of the central bank. But in transition world, in post-communist countries, you find more countries, yes, than elsewhere in the world. Are there any other questions? Yes, if just not to miss. Yes, David. Yes.
Yes, I had a couple of questions. The first one is for you, Mohense, yes. So when you talked that inflation targeting is superior, that's what you wanted to demonstrate, right? Is superior in relation to what? To other means, for example, exchange rate or money aggregate targeting, but in terms of curbing, of managing inflation, or in terms of inflation and economic growth. So this is. And then I had a very short question for Mr. Gharleghi. Yes. This model you developed is in a context of medium inflation. So the relation between the revenue of the country and central bank independence. So is the context of normal inflation, medium inflation, or it applies even in context of very high inflation or hyperinflation?
Well, yeah, let us take another question from DONGHYUN. Yes.
This is more of an observation. I enjoyed the paper, especially dividing countries into different groups. But anyway, I think this inflation targeting, right, is most useful for countries with very weak and bad policy regimes, countries like Venezuela, right? I mean, which are basically it's a nonsense populism that's ruining the country. For these kinds of countries, you need to tie down the hand of the central government.
Thank you so much. If I can add one remark from myself, abusing my power as a chairman, the paper by Reza Mohensi, you look, I think you take separate years for economic growth, and the periods, it's not the periods, and the period is from 2010 to 2017 or something like it. Normally when you examine the impact of something on economic growth, you take periods. If you take a particular year, in a particular year there may be an eruption of volcano, there may be an outflow of capital, or there may be a discovery of the deposits of the natural resources, right? So you have to control for 1,000 things. So normally you take the periods, right? And the longer the periods are, the better, right? And then you can make some conclusions about the impact of inflation targeting on. But anyway, that's the observation. So may I please ask the presenters to respond And please keep in mind, I think we're doing okay in terms of time. We'll take some 10 minutes out of lunchtime, but we'll be okay. But please keep in mind that lunchtime is approaching. Thank you so much. So, Anis, would you like to start?
There is no specific question to me about the Venezuela case. This is a good question, as I said. I mean, the inflation, high inflation is the one that affects the economy. But you really know this is all political game, because whether the Venezuela government is acting madly or because there is also all sorts of sanctions and other countries interfering, same with Iran. Say, for example, what can a government do when all these sanctions and barriers come into play? And so you have to only source the domestic finance. So we sometimes tend to forget that the economy operates within the political atmosphere. And I give you one example here. After the crisis in Indonesia, 1997-98, it's a very interesting story that many people don't know. The central bank government were being investigated for corruption. It was involved in when the crisis happened, in the bailout of one of the banks. So at that time, it was the first elected government of Abdurrahman Wahid. All he said when the inquiry was going on, all he said to the governor that you don't resign, but just remove yourself from the day-to-day business, just set yourself out. The IMF came said, no, you cannot sack or cannot do this to the central bank government. IMF was supporting a corrupt central bank government, and the government fell. And they replaced the government with the vice president. Megawati came to power by doing that. So this is the impact of central bank independence, inflation targeting, outside interference. Thank
you. At first, thank you for your question. I should say that I don't talk about the relation between inflation and the growth. I don't talk about that. I talk about the framework and a macroeconomic framework that we can use for monetary policy, inflation targeting. Inflation targeting is a regime, is a framework that we can use it to control the inflation, or to stabilize the price level. So. And it's completely different than a rule that we think about that, which means that inflation targeting is not a rule about the inflation and the relation between inflation and something else, as the Ben Bernanke or Mishkin talk about that. So, which means that I here talk about a framework and the relation of accepting or adopting that framework and the economic growth. This is completely different than the things that Dr. BEHROOZ talked about that. And about the period of time between 2010 and 2017, I want to say that I wanted to get rid of the crisis in 2008. And because of this, I use this period of time after the crisis. But you're right. If I want to expand this period, I should talk about the crisis, what happened over there. Is the crisis has any impact on the inflation targeting or growth or something like that? And I think the number of the sample that I have here, because I use the panel data, I think it's 98 data. It's good enough for this regression that we make over there. So I'm not sure that I can answer your question or not.
Just very briefly about your question, the PhD students. I mean, the idea of having an independent central bank is actually to control inflation. That's the idea. So what we found is having an independent central bank for poor countries would be beneficial. Not for developed countries, because for the independent central bank, basically they try to basically lower down the magnitude of the variation of inflation and also inflation itself. But since we have considered a sample of developed and developing countries, and later we divide those two, and as I said again, we just took into account the impact of central bank independence and economic growth. I mean, we did not really investigate, as of now, the inflation threshold. So there could be an inflation threshold as well in the middle that we should look into that. So about the countries that David asked about, I mean, hyperinflation countries and what is the basic nature of the sample. The sample that we used consists of 13 developed countries and 18 developing countries. So we had countries like Indonesia, Ethiopia, but I mean, there was no case of hyperinflation countries, but we had inflationary countries and also developed countries of very stable and low inflation. So basically, but I mean, still we are working on the results, and as I said, we should also take into account probably a panel threshold model that could capture a level of threshold for that. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Please enjoy your lunch and don't forget to come back at 1:40. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.